Languages change over time. Just as in English, the they pronoun is now used to talk about non-binary people or people whose gender we don't know, in Spanish, some people are starting to use inclusive language or Lenguaje inclusivo. But in English, you have it slightly easier because gender is not so present as in Spanish. In regular old-fashioned Spanish, just as in English, we express gender in pronouns, but we have a few more distinctions than he and she. We use él and ella, nosotros and nosotras, vosotros and vosotras, ellos and ellas. Then, unlike in English, most nouns have gender, not only those that refer to people, such as el enfermero and la enfermera, or el maestro and la maestra, but even inanimate objects. Don't worry, we don't use inclusive language with these, only when it comes to people. But gender is not only expressed in pronouns and nouns. We also have gender concordance with articles and adjectives. And finally, in traditional Spanish, there is something called generic masculine. What is generic masculine? It works like this. If there's an all-male group, we address it as masculine. If there's an all-female group, we address it as feminine. But if it's a mixed group, we address it as masculine. It only takes one man in a group of 100 women to make a group masculine. For some people, this is unfair to women, and not to mention non-binary people who are not even on the map. Inclusive Spanish is used to avoid all this. But how do we use it? As we said before, it can be used when we don't want to assume the gender of a person, when the person is non-binary, or for mixed groups. And since feminine gender in Spanish is usually marked with the letter A, and masculine gender with the letter O, the neutral inclusive alternative normally uses the letter E. For example, when it comes to pronouns, instead of él or ella, you can use ella. Instead of nosotros or nosotras, nosotres. Instead of vosotros or vosotras, vosotres. And instead of ellos or ellas, ellas. When it comes to articles, instead of el or la, you can use le. Instead of los or las, you can use les. Instead of un or una, you can use une. And instead of unos and unas, you can use unes. Same with adjectives and nouns. When gender is marked with a no or an a, you change it for an e. As we said before, this is only when it comes to people. For example, if you say, mi hija tiene 5 años, the word años remains unchanged. Because even if it's a masculine word, it doesn't really have a gender in the sense that people do. Same with objects. Finally, there are some adjectives and nouns that don't mark the gender with an A or an O. These remain the same when using inclusive language. Now, let's mention some things to have in mind when using written inclusive language. Because of the rules of Spanish grammar, when using inclusive language, in some cases you will have to change a C for a QU or a G for a GU. For example, chico or chica change to chique, and amigo or amiga change to amigue. Another thing to have in mind is that while it's still pronounced like an E, many people write inclusive words with an X or an at symbol. Remember, if you have to read this out loud, just use an E. Finally, there are a few gender words that cannot simply be changed with an E, like mother and father. But there are already some inclusive options being used, like sadre or padre. Of course, there are many conservative people who oppose the use of inclusive language, and many people who are indifferent to it. There are some people and institutions that acknowledge that Spanish is sexist, but they recommend avoiding the letter E. Instead, they propose avoiding gender marks when possible and when necessary, mentioning both men and women in mixed groups. But this can be problematic because it ignores non-binary people and it implies assuming people's genders when we don't always know it. Since the introduction of inclusive Spanish is not happening as slowly or organically as normal changes in languages usually happen, some people are also arguing that it will not prevail even if its intentions are good. But I believe this is not necessarily true, since gender perception is changing rapidly and it might become quickly unacceptable to use language as we use it today. In any case, you can choose if you want to use it or not. No one will judge you if you don't, especially if it's not your native language.